This afternoon's session is about heritage cemeteries, past losses and future possibilities. And I'm going to introduce the 5 speakers that we have, and there is an incredible wealth of experience, talent, and an opportunity for all of us, including me, to learn more about what we can do about these important components of our cultural heritage. I'm just going to test, the title of this session is Past Losses and Future Possibilities, and very quickly, about 4 years ago in the town of Midland, we realized that we owned a cemetery that we didn't even know that we did, the William Wilson Cemetery. And Steve Watson from GPR Solutions is going to talk a little bit about the work that he did for us last year. We discovered we owned this cemetery and we didn't know what to do with it. And our first concern was, what do we do with this thing? And as we thought about it some more, we started to think about the future possibilities of this heritage cemetery here in the town of Midland, and really what it could do to help us do a better job of telling our story. And I think, from an important perspective, our cemeteries, and in particular our heritage cemeteries, are an important asset, cultural asset, that we need to think about as we improve telling our story about the history of your communities, your towns, and your area. And so I'm hoping at the end of this session that we'll all understand a little bit better about what we can do about preserving, conserving, and celebrating these important assets in our heritage in each of our communities. So this session is a panel session. We're going to introduce the 5 panelists. We're then going to ask them all to do a presentation, 8, 10, 12 minutes each. And I'm going to try to hold them to that, although some of them I know I'm going to have a hard time doing it. And then we're going to actually pose a question for the panelists to discuss amongst themselves. And then we're going to ask you to ask your questions of these 5 people. So our 5 speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in order. Our first speaker is Wendy Shearer, and for many people, you don't need to know or don't need to have Wendy introduced to you. She's an award-winning landscape architect and heritage consultant with MHBC Planning in Kitchener. She has 30 years of experience in research and documentation and assessment and conservation planning. She's a member of the College of Fellows of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. And Wendy's done an incredible array in that 30 years. And I can tell you she was the person that wrote the first heritage impact assessment that the town of Midland ever asked for. I'm sad to say that was only 4 years ago that we asked for that. Our second speaker will be Steve Watson, who's the General Manager of Ground Penetrating Radar, GPR Services of Global GPR Services, Inc. I'm told that if you were watching the CBC television last week, he was on it as they were using the technology as part of a murder investigation in Southern Ontario. Steve has 25 years of experience in technical product development in geophysical instrumentation and microcomputer technology. And prior to joining Global Services, Steve is involved in GPR survey projects around the world. Our third speaker will be Michael DeMello. And Michael is with the Ministry of Consumer Services and is the registrar under the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act. He's responsible for 5,163 registered cemeteries across Ontario and 59 crematoriums in this province as well. As registrar, he also administers the legislation related to the discovery and disposition of burial sites, and so deals with a wide variety of issues related to Aboriginal issues as well as Euro-Canadian burial grounds. And I know I spoke with him when we discovered we owned the William Wilson Cemetery here in the town of Midland. Our fourth speaker will be Rob Leverty. Rob has been an executive director of the Ontario Historical Society and managing editor of its scholarly journal, Ontario History, since 2008. And he's worked closely with the Society in many capacities for 20 years, including restoration manager of the historic John Mackenzie House. He's been the executive director and chair of the Coalition on the Niagara Escarpment, and Rob is currently an elected officer of the board of the Niagara Escarpment Foundation. Rob and his partner Anne have a working farm in Beaver Valley. And our last speaker will be Andrew Jeans, who's worked in the heritage conservation field since 2005, studied at York University and in the heritage conservation program at Carleton University, and has been with the Ontario Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport since 2007 as a cultural services advisor in the Programs and Services branch. So what we've actually asked each of the speakers to do today is to talk specifically about the theme of this session, about protecting the historic and cultural values of heritage cemeteries in our communities in our province. And the order of the speakers, we're going to go from, I guess, the most specific to the most general, and I'm going to ask Wendy Shearer to lead us off this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Wes. I'm very delighted to be here. This is a topic that is something that I've been extremely interested in because cemeteries are very rich cultural landscapes. They vary incredibly from burial yards associated with churches to many vernacular cemeteries that across the rural province that follow the vernacular style of the rural cemetery movement that came to North America in the 1830s through Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we see also evidence of the very first municipal cemetery in Canada was created in the mid-1800s in Hamilton. It's associated with the lands across from Dundurn Castle, and we've been just discovering about it in one of our current projects. What I'm talking about today is how to deal with this variety of resource type that has a significance to our communities, and there's a process that we can use that works on every different type of resource, and that's what I'm going to move into. So the first some definitions. On the left, you'll see the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. It's a document that was prepared by the federal government and is in use throughout the country as providing detailed and sound, I would say practical information on how to make decisions about heritage resources. It is available online. If you aren't familiar with it, you can download a copy. But basically, it lays out a very practical process for dealing with heritage resources of very different types. The process has 3 steps: understanding, planning, and implementation. And when we apply these 3 steps to conservation of cemeteries, we can move through a process that gives us a sound basis for decision making based on a full understanding of the heritage evidence that we're dealing with, as well as the heritage values that are embodied in that evidence. Another piece of information that is used or is useful in guiding an analysis of a heritage cemetery is the Heritage Act Regulation 906, and many of you will be familiar with it. It describes different criteria that can be applied to assist in determining heritage value. And the criteria that I think most easily are understood are design or physical values, and I think the average person can look at physical resources and talk about the qualities that have heritage significance. The aspects of cemeteries, however, though, often lie in the field of associative values, and these are intangible values that relate to the culture that created the cemetery. And I've shown 2 examples here from much of the traveling that I've been doing over the years. On the left is the Harling Point Cemetery in Victoria. It was a cemetery created by the Chinese Benevolent Society, and it was a cemetery designed according to Feng Shui design principles. All the Chinese families from across the country sent their deceased people to this cemetery. They were interred there and then processed for transshipment back to China. So one of the most important parts of that cemetery is the orientation to the homeland, to China. Understanding that intangible value of the layout of the cemetery is really fundamental in planning for the setting and any other aspects of the cemetery to understand that design intent. And on the right-hand side is an example of a First Nation cemetery in Taos, New Mexico. And when I first went there, I was really taken by the fact that many of the wooden crosses were tilting and falling over, and many of them had been gathered up and piled against the church. And it was only when I was told that the crosses and their condition are evidence of the belief system that an ancestor upon death begins a journey to the other side. And the cross is only needed in a vertical position while the person is traveling. And as the journey continues, the cross starts to tilt. And when they've arrived at the other side, the cross is on the ground, gathered up and set aside. So again, understanding the meaning of those crosses would lead to a decision-making about how you're going to maintain the cemetery. And a plan that called for improvements and making sure everything was nice and vertical would be really contrary to the important values associated with that particular cemetery. So in order to assist with planning, I'm going to break a cemetery into what are traditional 6 different components that are found consistently, although not exclusively, to cemeteries, especially historic cemeteries. So the first component is topography. Most heritage cemeteries, where they can, have been built on higher points of land where there's a scenic quality to the landform, a rolling topography. And this is all part of that traditional idea of a picturesque landscape, part of the rural cemetery movement, so that the visitor to the cemetery would not only go there to remember their loved one, but also have a very positive and calming experience. It would be a restorative experience for the visitor in a park-like setting. So we see the arrangements of the grave markers to accentuate the topography of the site. The second component is circulation. And on the right-hand side, you see an image of a very organic layout. This is in Woodland Cemetery in Hamilton. And within the road pattern, which is very curvilinear and organic, we see a very regimented plotting pattern. So the graves themselves are laid out in a very orderly way, but the overall organization of the cemetery has a rather scenic quality to it. It's part of the original design. And the image on the left-hand side is Ross Bay Cemetery in Victoria. Again, when it was set up, part of the belief of the city fathers that created it was that it should act as a nursery. So all the roads within the cemetery were lined with trees, and the intention was that as the city grew, those trees would be moved out into the community to line the streets. So again, part of that first step in conservation planning is understanding the cemetery, the origin of it. So knowing that about the idea of the cemetery as a nursery would help to guide future decision making about that particular cemetery. The next important element of the cemetery layout has to do with the idea of enclosure and controlled access. Many rural cemeteries, when they were first established, were part of a broader landscape where there were farm animals, so it was natural to have some sense of enclosure. Most rural cemeteries do not have ornamental fencing. It's usually a pretty standard page wire farm type fencing, or today we'll see chain link fencing. But most cemeteries have some kind of defined edge. The image on the right is the cemetery at the former psychiatric hospital in the neighboring community of Penetanguishene. And while many of the burial locations are unknown of the patients who passed away there over the years, the recognition of them has been incorporated into the gateway. So again, a very important commemorative element marking the entrance, the place as you enter into the cemetery. I think one of the most dramatic components of the cemetery, rural cemeteries in particular, is the vegetation collection. It's an integral part of the picturesque landscape, and we'll see today evidence of historic plantings of yew, cedar, Norway spruce, particularly around the edge of the cemetery. Frequently there are sugar maples, Japanese maples from the early 20th century, and the ubiquitous lilac. These are components are very commonly found in most cemeteries, as well as lower ground covers such as lily of the valley, tiger lilies. So understanding the historically planted vegetation is a very important part of decision making on the future care of the cemetery. And I wanted to highlight the fact that sometimes the lack of vegetation is also an important part of the culture that created the cemetery. And so here on the right we have a Mennonite cemetery in Waterloo County, and obviously vegetation would be considered a form of ornamentation or embellishment that would be contrary to a value system. So understanding that, you could predict that if you were developing an improvement plan, you definitely wouldn't undertake tree planting in that particular cemetery because you would be contrary to the value. Views. When we think of the picturesque landscape, we think of views out, not for obviously the residents of the cemetery, but for the visitors. So again, Ross Bay overlooking the Straits of Juan de Fuca. In Ontario, a lot of our cemeteries are sited, so there's a view out over a rolling landscape that's borrowed and brought into the cemetery. Or on the right-hand side, you'll see the views within a cemetery, and these are war graves in a burial site in Hamilton. And here, the key part of the view is the order and the repetition and the spacing of these graves create a very dramatic view and are part of that, what is meaningful about that cemetery. And one of the other aspects that I wanted to mention regarding cemetery layout has to do with the orientation of the markers. In Ontario, because again, culturally driven, most of the markers are laid so they face the east. And this is a part of a belief system that on Judgment Day you could rise up and face the rising sun. And so that's a very traditional layout pattern that you'll encounter in many of the cemeteries. And the sixth component then are grave markers. They vary widely, and this is really you could have a whole conference just on different types of grave markers. They come in different materials, different styles. They have different symbols on them from different periods that have very specific meanings. But the key part of a grave marker is that they are traditionally located at the top of the grave, of the burial, and that it's essential that wherever possible the grave marker not be moved. Once that bond is broken between the burial and the stone itself, that bond is lost, and it's very difficult to recreate it. So finally, now I'm going to talk about the challenges with conserving our heritage cemeteries, and I have 3 examples of past practices that we would no longer consider to be appropriate. The top 2 and the bottom right. This was a practice typically around in the years of Confederation and Centennial, where a lot of pioneer cemeteries where the stones were gathered together into a new composition, and that made grass cutting quite easy. And what happened is those stones now are deteriorating because of this installation in concrete in various ways. So the best way to deal with grave markers is, first of all, to be guided by conservation of stone practices. That's a special expertise. And if a stone is damaged, such as the bottom left, to leave the pieces in situ on the grave in anticipation of someday restoration. And the only further advice is that if possible there should be a gravel bed put down so the pieces are not sitting directly on soil, and that gives a break to help preserve them. we were working with the City of Ottawa on the Billings Estate Cemetery, and it's a unique cemetery in that it contains both family members and residents from the neighborhood, so settlers as well. It was on the Billings Estate farm in a former sheep meadow, and it's in that little field right there. It started life as a sheep meadow. Even until we started work, there was still farm fencing around 3 sides of it. It had been studied in about 20 years ago, and details of all the type of fencing that were created at that time. But our challenge was to make it accessible. And so what we did as part of our restoration work, we removed the invasive plants that had grown into it by shallow excavation, no more than 6 inches or 150, to ensure that they were removed. We added in 3 inches of soil so as not to impact on the vegetation collection, and we compacted and reseeded. At the end of our work, we had a very level turf area that is an acceptable surface for wheelchairs and for people with mobility challenges. So the appearance of the site was not altered. We didn't have to add in walkways or anything, but we were able, through our remedial work, to improve accessibility through the site. We also developed maintenance recommendations, and basically what we said is that grass cutting is the #1 operation that it takes place. The grass should be cut so that it's longer when it's cut, that we don't need to have it short like a front lawn or a bowling green. That allows for deep root growth so it can withstand drought conditions. And under no circumstances should wire trimmers be used against the grave markers, or worse yet, around the trees, because of the damage that they do. And we recommended that there be a narrow saucer of mulch around all the trees so that there'd be no temptation to run the trimmer around it. As with all cemeteries, there is a natural renewal that's needed, and in the case of the Billings Cemetery, we had to acknowledge that several of the trees that were there were either being lost through the emerald ash borer, or they were really at the end of their life and were potential hazard trees. So we recommended a renewal planting plan that would take place. And as part of our interpretive work for the site, we installed 9 very low markers in the alignment that you see in the center image there to represent the location of the 9 marble markers that had been installed by the family in the early 20th century, but sadly were vandalized and had to be removed from the cemetery. And the question that we were asked was, should we make replicas and put them back? And we said, no, that wouldn't follow best practices. And they said, well, can we put the originals back? And we said, no, that wouldn't follow best practices either, because many of them were all broken. And so I said, what's really significant about putting back is to mark the location, because as you can see, this line of markers didn't follow any traditional pattern. So it was important to show where they had been and then to interpret through plaquing why the family had placed them in that location. And so my final aspect of conservation has to do with interpretation. And my example for interpretation is from Ruthven Park National Historic Site, which is in Cayuga, New York, or Cayuga, Ontario. It's owned by the Lower Grand River Trust. And what's important about it, it has 2 cemeteries on the property. It's approximately 1,200 acres. One of them is a family cemetery, and the other is this cemetery, which is really the only evidence, but for one small building, of a whole town of people that work there, Irish workers. And the work on the restoration of the cemetery was undertaken by volunteers. The director of the site arranged for the volunteers to have a training session and do work under the direction of a conservator. They reset all the stones, and if the stones were too broken, they laid them on the ground on a gravel bed. and they repositioned them where they knew they had been located, and they're all sitting there now, all facing the east, except for one, which interestingly enough is turned to the west. And the story is that that belongs to a defrocked priest that served the community, so he's facing the west. They now have a GIS map or plan of the cemetery, so you can go there and electronically look at this, and each of the stones has been recorded with a photograph, and the information that is on the stone is recorded there, so you can do research. And it's a way of preserving not only the stones, but the information on the stones, which is equally valuable from a heritage point of view. So I wanted to highlight the work that was done there. And finally, I just want to sum up by saying how special cemeteries are as places in our community. And this image is in Iqaluit, on the south end of Baffin Island. I was there in July. And what's remarkable about the community is every stick of wood and every bit of paint has to be shipped in during the time when the sea is open. And despite that limitation, great effort has been spent on this cemetery, showing it as a place that's valued by the community. And so to me, it really represents how important these spaces are in our community, and that the understanding the culture that's created them is really important in determining the best way forward and how to conserve the physical evidence that remains of their important past. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. And of course, I'm doing a lousy job as a moderator because I'll let Wendy go a lot longer than the 10 minutes, but that's okay. She had a lot of experience to impart to us. We're now going to ask Steve, and I'm going to ask the rest of the gentlemen on the panel to try to stay around the 10 or 12 minutes so that we can actually get some questions from the floor. Steve?
Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I'm going to be talking about the use of a technology that is a non-invasive technology to help do several things within the cemetery, primarily locate burials and also delineate the actual burial site. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology just so you understand what it is we do. I'm not going to go into the scientific depths because I'm sure I would put you all to sleep, but we'll talk about a little bit about the technology, and then I'm going to use the William Wilson Cemetery as an example of what we did. So GPR, which is the term we use, is ground penetrating radar, and it is a technology that uses radio signals very similar to your cell phones, 1,000 times less power than your cell phone, and we penetrate the ground with it. And there's a phenomenon that happens when the signal enters the ground. It reflects back from changes in the electrical properties of the material that it's passing through. So think of it as, for any of you that have seen one, a fish finder for the ground. And the equipment records the echoes that come back. There's software that interprets the data that comes back, and then there's people that interpret the data that is being interpreted by the software. So we build images of what is in the ground. So when we talk about it, it's a pseudo image. It is not a photograph. It is an interpretation of what's going on in the ground. Then we have to put the pieces together. So there's my fish finder example. We send out a ping, reflects off the bottom of the pond in this case, reflects off the fish, and we get an image. And we call them fish finders. They are not fish finders, by the way, because they don't work. I've never found a fish yet. When we get this image, we can build a three-dimensional model of the ground. And this is key. So we have depth, and we have the position that we've seen, whatever the anomaly is in the ground. And the biggest thing that we measure are two things: the amplitude of the return signal, which gives us the different colors, and the time. Now think of the time. We are measuring time in nanoseconds. That's point with 9 zeros and a 1. That's how quickly we measure the time. And so because we measure time, we have what we call time windows. So I can look at something from 30 nanoseconds to 40 nanoseconds, or 70 nanoseconds to 80 nanoseconds. And we call those layers. And it actually allows me to really remove everything above where I'm looking and take a look at what's in the ground. So we can actually step down through the ground and see the burials. I will clarify one thing right now so you understand: we do not see bones. And I talked about that on CBC last Wednesday night. Bones have a property where they actually absorb the minerals out of the ground. So as a casket or the bag or however they were buried decays and the bones are exposed to the minerals, the bones become electrically the same as the ground. The one thing that does not change is the disturbed soil. So soil is made up of many, many, many layers. And so those layers, when you dig in it and you mix them up, you change the electrical property of the soil in the dig compared to the native soil on the side. And that's primarily what we look for. We can see caskets. If the casket is still there, we can still see evidence. We did one search for a body for the police. The person had a 9-inch pin. We were looking for the 9-inch pin because the steel does reflect and does not deteriorate. It was surgical steel. So, but what's really important, when you watch CSI and Bones and all those other shows, and they show those beautiful pictures on the screen of bones and skeletons, that's not what we see. We see something different, and I'm going to show you that. The key is that this is a non-destructive technique. It does not damage the property at all. Yes, you will see some wheel tracks where we go. That's about the extent of it. They will grow back in a very short period of time. This is very difficult for some people to visualize. This is a 3D rendering of, in this case, it's actually concrete because it was easier to sort of show. But you can see that we have 3 dimensions to this. We have the depth, we have width, and we have length. And that helps us determine when we're looking at burial sites. It's very similar to looking at a ultrasound of a baby. Unless you know what you're looking at, you haven't got a clue what you're looking at. So it is critical that it be done by people that understand and can look at the images and interpret them. So this is this is the radiogram. So this is the raw radar data. That's a slice through the ground, and we're looking at that end of the slice. So from the top down is depth, and from left to right is the way that the equipment was moved across the ground. And we get this little disturbance in the ground. It can be as subtle as that, is what we're looking for. That would be a very old burial where the remains have actually decayed, and we're only looking at disturbed soil. The technology, this is just showing you, it's like a lawnmower. We walk it across, and we can identify things buried. This is an archaeological, those would be stone walls, whether it's a stone wall, burial, voids, mineral deposits. There's all kinds of things we can use the technology for. But it's literally like a lawnmower that we walk across the property. So let's talk about a specific case. So this is the location of where the William Wilson Cemetery was believed to be. If you look at the hatched area, there was a portion of it was in the field, and there was a big portion of it that was in trees and shrubs. So the town actually did a great job of trying to clean out everything that they could so that we could get in between all the trees and whatnot and survey. And then we surveyed out in the field area as well. You'll see when we go to the next slide, there's an area where I couldn't survey because there was just too much small shrub and we couldn't get it cleared out. So what we do is we set up a grid, and it's a very laborious technique. We just go back and forth and back and forth, about 2 feet to 3 feet apart, and we just do hundreds of lines across the piece of property in both directions. Then we have software that takes all that and creates these maps out of it. So what you're seeing on these maps, I've left the radar or the scan lines just so you can sort of see the number of lines that we have to do in any one area. So the first one on the left is inside the treed area, and the one to the right is in the field area. I then take it and put the two pieces together so you can see the area in the middle that we couldn't survey. You'll see a little slight swipe going through at about 11 o'clock. That's because there was a roadway cut through the bush, and we followed it right through just so in case we could see something in that. That's what we look like when we're out working. Head down watching the screen, the other guy watching out for bears, animals, or people. Often when we're in cemeteries, we will get people coming in and telling us to get off the cemetery and not walk on the graves and whatnot. And we explain to them that we're not doing anything that's going to damage anything. And so, but that's what it's like, and it looks easy. But believe me, when you do this and you walk 9 miles just doing that little area, you're pretty tired at the end of it, pushing that through the grass. And we were very fortunate that they cut the grass for us. So this, again, is a raw radar line from the William Wilson Cemetery. And there was one really neat thing that, well, I find it neat, that we found. And you'll see a buried pipe. And there's actually a buried pipe going right through the cemetery. And our guess is that pipe was probably put in after the cemetery. So somebody didn't know that they were going through the cemetery. So you can see where I've identified areas of disturbed soils, geological features. So you're going to get geological features. You're going to get balls of clay that the glaciers have pushed down, big rocks, and that's the key, is we have to learn to identify those. And that's one of the key things in doing this work. So we had one burial in this image. We had a pipe that nobody knew was there, and we had some geological features. So at the end of it, this is what we end up with. We identify, so the little yellow ovals are where the burials are. That little black line is that pipe that goes through the burials. And you can see the area that we couldn't survey is really clean, and then the area in the trees where we found burials as well. And just to give you an idea, with everything removed, this is where they were all located within the image. Now, what we can do from this is we can actually obtain some information, because if we look at this, we actually have some clusters, and we have some that are spread apart, or individuals. So you can probably interpret from that we have some families, and we have some, just, what would they call them, transients that were passing through, or just local people or single people that had passed away and were buried in the cemetery. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. I will tell you, we, based on anecdotal and local history, we thought that there were 9 burials at the William Wilson Cemetery, and that they were all in the trees. And I think that's what the local history was as well, which probably tells us why that there was a pipe put through an area of the cemetery, because nobody knew that there were burials in that part of the William Wilson Cemetery. Next up is Michael DeMello.
Oh boy, after those two, talks. I'm not sure where I'm going to start. Let me start by just thanking Wes for inviting me to come out. I'm really honored to be able to talk to you all because you all are interested in preservation of cemeteries, heritage cemeteries, historic cemeteries. You're volunteers, and you'll really do work that I'm involved with that pretty well from start to finish. So I'm involved with establishing cemeteries, and then I run the whole gamut to trying to ensure that these cemeteries are preserved. So I'm going to try and do a presentation to you in 10 minutes, presentation that I normally take 2.5 hours to do, okay? So what I'd like from you all is, if you have any questions, I think we're going to take questions later, but if you have anything right at while I'm talking about something, put your hand up and ask the question, okay? That'll keep you all awake. It's 4 o'clock, right? So let me start by saying I have, I think, the most interesting job in the world because I deal with cemeteries and I deal with every aspect of cemeteries. I deal with every religious denomination, ethnic group. It runs the gamut, Jewish cemeteries, Muslim cemeteries. I deal with scattering, crematoriums, interment rites, families today trying to make claims on interment rights from 150 years ago. And we talked about, I heard Wendy talk about monuments and inscriptions on monuments and how you want to preserve them. But then we have this generation who comes along and says, that's my great-grandfather's monument, and I want to put my name on it. And what do? Do we allow them to put their name on, or do we not? We have families that fight over monuments, and then they decide they want to spin the monument around. So we had one case of the spinning monument. But we do run the gamut in dealing with cemeteries, and so I'm going to try and give you an overall picture of what our legislation is all about and how we are trying to ensure that cemeteries are preserved, because we realize a cemetery is a cemetery is a cemetery. It stays a cemetery in perpetuity. We need to make certain that from the day it's established, it can be maintained and it can reflect our history, our heritage, all these different things. My parents are now buried in Ontario, and so I have a vested interest in making sure that these cemeteries are maintained and our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren have some place to go and visit and look at these cemeteries and look at their history, right? So cemeteries are not only a business, and unlike any other business, it's a business that's in perpetuity. So when someone establishes a cemetery initially, it's usually a little bit of a money-making thing. It's related to religion. It's related to all these things. But at the end of the day, it's something that's being established for perpetuity. So our new legislation that came into force July 1st, 2012, is called the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act. Okay? And I'm going to give you a quick run-through of what this act does. It deals with the removal of co-location of ownership, co-location, and the restrictions related to cemeteries and funeral establishments. Previously, if you owned a cemetery, you couldn't own a funeral establishment. Under the new act, you can own any one of these bereavement-related activities, and you can have it all on the one site. So you could possibly have a cemetery that has a funeral establishment, a crematorium, transfer service, have it all. You can have one-stop shopping. Or you can have just a mausoleum, that an area of a cemetery that's only got a mausoleum, or an area or a cemetery that's only made up of columbariums, or a cemetery that only has in-ground graves. The other thing that's happened is crematoriums can now be established off cemetery property. So whereas previously you had to have a crematorium within the limits of a cemetery, you can now have it, next to the Max Milk, whatever. But they have to get municipal approval and environmental approval for the location of the cemetery, of the crematorium, before we will license it. But again, it allowed for certain ethnic groups, certain communities that want to have their own crematorium, and they want to have it either close, so in the vicinity of the community. So this allows them to do that. Okay. Municipal approval and registers consent for cemeteries and crematoriums. Again, we do not license a cemetery unless they have municipal approval. And part of the establishment of I'm going to jump to something. Part of the establishment of a cemetery these days is that they must, before we license them, they must have $100,000 to put into a care and maintenance fund. And one of the other things about this legislation, it's focused a lot on increasing the care and maintenance fund. We talk about maintenance of cemeteries. How are they going to be maintained in perpetuity if they don't have money? And so we focused on this right through the legislation. How do we increase the care and maintenance funds so that these cemeteries will be well looked after? We talked about monuments being damaged, destroyed, being taken off property because they can't maintain cemeteries. We now have a care and maintenance fund on the monuments as well. So when a lot is sold, there's an amount of money that goes into the care and maintenance from the lot. And when a monument is installed, there's an amount of money that goes into the care and maintenance fund as well. And the interest generated on that is to be used for the care and maintenance of a cemetery, okay, in perpetuity. Unfortunately, we have a lot of cemeteries that don't have care and maintenance funds, and this is where you guys come in terms of volunteering to help restore these cemeteries, maintain these cemeteries, and working with the municipality to make sure these cemeteries are maintained and not abandoned. I'm sort of flying all over the place. Anyway, so let me just quickly go through here. We have consumer protection enhancements as well. One of the big problems we had was with interment rights. Someone goes to a cemetery and they buy an interment right, and they've had a death in the family, so the wife goes to the cemetery. Usually the wife survives longer. So she goes to the cemetery, and she not only buys a lot for herself and her husband, she buys for 4 of her children. She's all happy. She's not all happy. She's satisfied. She's looked after them. The funeral takes place, and of course every funeral has disputes, family disputes. Everyone's up in an uproar. The following week she decides those ungrateful children don't need those 4 monuments that she's paid for, right? So she would go back to the cemetery and say, I want a refund. And the cemetery would say, you can get your price less the care and maintenance back. Because that's the way the law was. If you bought a lot, once you paid the price, 40% went into the care and maintenance fund. So the new legislation has changed that. It's given them a cooling off period. So when you buy an interment right as of July 1st, 2012, you have a cooling off period. You have 30 days within which to come back and get all your money. But on the 31st day, 40% or $250, the greater off, will go into a care and maintenance fund. So that's something else this act did. It gives the rights to refund and resales of interment rights and scattering rights. So if you bought interment rights in 1980 and you paid $400 for those lots, and today those lots are worth $3,000, you can possibly go back to the cemetery and say, you want to sell these lots back to the cemetery for today's price, right? Now again, we get into this, the 2 things the cemetery has to do. They either decide they're going to prohibit the resales, in which case they buy it back for the price that you paid less the care and maintenance that went into the fund, or they might say, no, you can sell it to someone else on Kijiji, Craigslist, but the transfer has to be done through the cemetery, okay? And what cemetery owners need to know is that when they do the transfer and they charge for an administrative fee on the transfer, they better be sure they're transferring the interment rights from the correct person, the person who had the right to sell those lots before they do the transfer. Because once they transfer it to someone else, they're taking the responsibility for those lots. Okay, so it allows the resales. We talk about price lists and bylaws. Just by the way, I brought some consumer information guides, which is a how to arrange a funeral for dummies, right? So it tells you what to do when you're in the planning stage, prior to any that's occurring in the family. It tells you what you can do once someone dies. What do you do? Do you want to go cremation? Do you want to go full burial? Do you want, all these different things? So I've got a few here. I've got a few in the booth down there. They're very, very good information for those who are kind of not too familiar with dealing with these sensitive things. But from the consumer protection point of view, every person who goes into a cemetery to buy an interment right must receive the Consumer Information Guide prior to signing a contract. We want to make sure that we don't have, the grandmother that goes and buys 4 lots and doesn't know what to do with it, right? So it provides that protection. We talk about care and maintenance fund, and I'm going to relate this to the next slide, okay, which is a breakdown of the cemeteries in Ontario. Okay, we have 5,163 registered cemetery sites. A cemetery site is an actual cemetery. It might be one burial, it might be 3,000 or 150,000 burials, right? That is a site. So we have 5,163, of which about 3,000 of them are active sites. So like I said, cemeteries are cemeteries are cemeteries. They remain a cemetery unless we go through a closure process. And I know Rob doesn't want to hear the word closure, but the legislation allows for something called closure. And when we close a cemetery, we're talking about disinterring those remains and moving them to another cemetery, right? We're not talking about closing it to further burials because there's no land in the cemetery, right? So these are cemeteries. The 5,163 sites that we know of are cemeteries where we know their burials. Now, quite often, a cemetery is called by 3 different names. So it'll be called the Springville Cemetery. It'll be called the Municipal, I'm trying to think of the names, but it'll have 2 or 3 different names. And so quite often we'll get someone saying, but this cemetery doesn't show on your database. When we do get the proper description of the cemetery, you'll find that they're one and the same. Now, one of the things that we're doing is we're sending out new license application forms to every cemetery, and we're asking for all detailed information about the cemetery. We're saying, is your cemetery boundary surveyed? I think 50% of the cemeteries that we have out there are not surveyed. So if you're involved in the cemetery, you're on the volunteer board, you know about cemeteries, one way of preserving a cemetery is to make certain the boundaries have been surveyed and those boundaries have been registered in the Land Registry Office. That is one of the... Yes, question.
I was kind of wondering what responsibility a municipality would have with regard to pioneer cemeteries.
Okay. So a landowner is responsible to maintain a cemetery on his land. Okay. If we don't know the landowner, which happens quite often, there's no records of who the landowner is, the municipality is responsible for abandoned cemeteries. Okay? Now I say that quite, just municipalities are responsible. There is a process of how the municipality becomes responsible for a cemetery. Previously, municipalities took on the abandoned cemeteries in the area and they maintained them. What we're saying to municipalities under the legislation says the municipality can order the owner of the land to maintain that cemetery. And if the owner doesn't maintain it, the municipality may go in and maintain the cemetery and charge the owner the cost of the maintenance. Okay? Now that's easier said than done because quite often municipality is a little hesitant to go on and take that kind of action. But the legislation allows for that. And so we say to municipalities, listen, if you've got all these cemeteries in your area that you're maintaining and you're finding it a real burden, maybe you should spend a little time and try and track down who the owner of the land is. Okay? And what happens is, in some municipalities, they will go to court and they will ask the judge to declare the land of the cemetery abandoned, in which case the judge will deed the land to the municipality along with an easement. Then at least the municipality knows, listen, we're the owners of the cemetery, and we maintain it, we have access to it, we can serve the community's needs by maintaining the cemetery. But if the municipality doesn't take that kind of action, then they go into the cemetery on a one-off basis, and they might cut the grass and come back out, and the cemetery is pretty well left unattended. So what we are trying to do from this end, rather than worrying about the historic and heritage, the historic edge, waiting for this thing to be 200 years and abandoned, we're saying to people who are running cemeteries now, build your care and maintenance fund, keep proper records. You were talking about records. I remember we went to do inspections on some of these cemetery people. One lady had all the records in a shoebox under her bed. The other gentleman had the list of burials on the roll-up blind in his bedroom. Right? That is not going to help the preservation and of cemeteries. So, one thing I want to point out, we have 2,400 cemetery operators, of which 1,576 small operators have less than $100,000 in their care and maintenance. In fact, some of them have $3,500, $3,000, $5,000 in their care and maintenance funds. And that's because a lot of current cemeteries didn't collect care and maintenance, and some of them refuse to collect care and maintenance now. They say, well, we can't hit them up for care and maintenance. The minimum care and maintenance on a lot now is $250. The greater of 40% and $250. And if people don't collect the care and maintenance and put it in a care and maintenance fund or account, that money is going to go by the wayside, and you're going to end up with abandoned cemeteries. So we try and make that connection to them and say to them, if you don't collect the money now for these lots, for these graves that you're selling, you're not going to have a care and maintenance fund, and you're not going to have a cemetery that's going to be maintained in perpetuity. So I got the sign to cut it. So thanks very much. I'd appreciate anyone that has any concerns, questions, feel free to call the ministry, call us, and we'd be only too pleased to help you out with anything we can do. Okay? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to go to Rob right away. I do apologize for keeping everybody short, but hopefully we'll get to some questions that, if you have specific questions, Michael can get more into his presentation.
Thank you. I'm blind. Has anybody got sunglasses? I tell you, the bright lights today, and Andrew, I'm going to make sure you have lots of time to speak. On behalf of the Ontario Historical Society, I'd like to thank Community Heritage Ontario and the Architectural Society of Ontario for the tremendous work you do, your membership, to protect the history of Ontario. So it's a great privilege to be here today. And also, it was in the marketplace today, and met many of the heritage committees are here, and we salute the work that you do all across Ontario. So congratulations on your work. Why are cemeteries important? Why do we bother protecting them? Well, I think the key thing I'm going to say today is our membership. The Ontario Historical Society was founded in 1888 by 8 local historical societies. And they were concerned about cemeteries then. The War of 1812 cemeteries that were being desecrated, and the tombstones were falling. If you move to today, 125 years later, our membership is just over 890 organizations and institutions across Ontario. And the key thing is our membership is all cultures and all religions. And that's probably the key thing I want to tell you today. For example, the province passed a Cemetery Act in 1991, and in it we strongly opposed that bill. because there was really no heritage component in it. For example, there's a closure section where you can, if you want to relocate a cemetery, you apply to the registrar, and he can order to be moved in the public interest. And the province did not define the public interest. Now, this is before Michael's time, but the registrar in 1995, the first test case was the Clendenin Cemetery in Markham. About half the size of this room, early 1800s, early pioneers. And the province, the Attorney General's office argued that it should be relocated for condominium development. So the Ontario Genealogical Society and the Ontario Historical Society appealed the province. For the very first time, we had a case in the province where we had a legal hearing. What's the public interest? What is heritage? We thought it would be a couple of days, maybe cost us $5,000. Well, it went on for over 2 years. And I'm not going to bore you with it, but the key thing for us was when the Attorney General's office put in evidence that this cemetery was not important. And that's why it should not be protected. And that goes back to our membership. And so we then had to build the case against the province. What is important? Why should cemeteries be protected? And it's a whole view of how you look at history. Is it just about, they argued, well, there were no important people buried there. No politicians, military leaders. And we have a whole view, if you look at our scholarly journal over the last 100 years, a very broad social history approach based on, as a democratic organization, our membership. Every cemetery is important. So we don't get into heritage cemeteries in many respects. They're all important historically and very much important to our membership. Good news is that we won that case. The province ruled, the tribunal ruled in our favor. And the town of Markham ultimately went on to designate it as an historic cemetery. I think the other one key power we have is, so we don't always use legal powers, but another legal power we have is that we're the only not-for-profit in North America that has the power to incorporate other not-for-profits. And so one model we've been using has been to incorporate groups where cemeteries are threatened. It's about ownership. Who owns the cemetery? For example, near Waterloo, recently I was, about a year ago, contacted by Quakers, and their cemetery was threatened with relocation. And so we incorporated them. The Samuel Bechtel Burying Ground, very, very old cemetery in this province. And they're now working to get charitable status, and the land, it will be transferred to them, hopefully, by the church. Of course, Jewish cemeteries are, desecration is a very big concern of ours. And we just incorporated a few months ago the Paris Plains Historical Society. Oh, early, beautiful cemetery. Unfortunately, there the municipality really doesn't have the money or is not concerned about it. And it's threatened by a gravel pit. Not only that, but there's also a very beautiful church there too, early 1800s. So our role, we see, is to help develop independent democratic voices at the local level, like the Hampton Historical Society, who I see here today. Education, of course, is very important, crucial, and you all play a very important role. For example, one of the heritage committees mentioned to me this morning, it's not, Bob, all about buildings. We're concerned about buildings too. We have a building in Willowdale that was to be demolished. And every year for the last 14 years, we've done doors open. Just recently, we had over 1,000 people come. I think one of the most exciting features the last few years, which we've really encouraged, is that many of you have opened doors open to include cemeteries. So congratulations. That's really important. I talked to the group from Pelham today, and they were telling me about the tours the region of Niagara are doing. Hamel, incredible cemeteries. Robin McKee has been doing tours there, educational tours. The important role of bringing school kids in, really crucial. We work with the police to cut down on, of course, demolition, desecration of cemeteries. And we encourage you to work with environmental groups. I actually got involved in cemeteries because I love trees, and I used to work for environmental groups. In this province, the great trees are in the cemeteries, the heritage trees. And so we encourage you, if you do Doors Open, to encourage environmentalists and naturalists to explain the trees and the plants. Some great work done in Northumberland on this issue. We think as a democratic organization, we report to our members. I think in 1995, when we had these battles with the province, we started in our newspaper, we set aside a column called Cemetery News. And 18 years later, we're still overwhelmed with articles. But it's a great switchboard. People sharing models, good stewardship. And we also established a cemetery defense fund where people can give us money to carry on our work. But of course, we cannot, fight government unless we have private money to do that. I think that also keeps us honest and makes us work hard. Last year, we had some very nice estates given to us for people who were concerned about cemeteries in this province. I'm going to, time is short, but I wanted to talk about the municipal heritage committees. Your work is incredibly important because so many of the municipalities in this province own cemeteries. And political leadership is crucial at the local level. So I'm very pleased to see today a deputy mayor here from Grey Highlands, Deputy Mayor McQueen. That's really encouraging. That's important at that level, that people are coming and are concerned about it. Finally, Pickering Historical Society about 2005 invited me to do a tour of their cemeteries because they're threatened, those cemeteries, with the development of the new airport. And there were 29 of them. And you should go before it's destroyed. It's absolutely like the Twilight Zone. The buildings are going to go, but the cemeteries we're fighting to save. And of those 29, I noticed there were 9 not on the government records. They don't legally exist in this province. So we thought, you know what? OGS is a very important partner. We decided to record how many cemeteries in this province are not registered. We thought maybe 100, 200. Well, we've come up with over 1,300 cemeteries. Incredibly important historic sites in this province. So our commitment the last 2 years, we met Minister Gerritsen, and he agreed that if we submit these cemeteries, they will be registered. And so we've now, going across, our volunteers systematically recording and providing the exact location. And so far, we've, in the last year, given to the province Algoma, Brant, Bruce, Carleton, Cochrane, Dundas, and Durham. And we're just about to submit the unregistered cemeteries for Frontenac, Glengarry, and Grenville. And this is, to us, absolutely crucial, important work. And I say to our volunteers who are working around the clock to do this work, this is your legacy to the people of Ontario and to the membership of the Ontario Historical Society. Thank you very much for... Yeah. So we are
a little pressed for time, so I'm going to just say hi and say, as the representative of the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, how happy I am to be addressing you today. We are the ministry that's responsible for administering the Ontario Heritage Act, which provides a number of really important protective tools for heritage cemeteries. Of course, it's the municipalities that have the prime role under the law in actually carrying out that protection. So I'm going to be talking a lot about what municipalities can do. So there's a menu of options that you have available to you as a municipal government to protect heritage cemeteries. The simplest one is listing a property on the municipal register of heritage properties. And what I would say to you is that establishes a baseline level of municipal recognition. If your municipality, if your community has cemeteries of cultural heritage value, and you all do, there's no good reason that those should not be listed on their municipal registers. So work with your municipal heritage committees, work with your councils, get those cemeteries listed. There are other tools which may or may not be appropriate depending on the circumstances, but individual designation, which provides a measure of municipal approval for alterations, and that's important when you're talking about cemeteries as cultural heritage landscapes, including a cemetery as part of a larger heritage conservation district. Easements, which can be either with the municipality or with the Ontario Heritage Trust. If you add up all of those different protective mechanisms, so Michael has his list of about just over 5,100 cemeteries. A little under 200 cemeteries in Ontario have one form or another of heritage protection on them, so a very small fraction of the total number. But there are tools beyond the Ontario Heritage Act that are important, and those fall under the Planning Act. And if you're looking at protection for attributes that in fact have extend outside the boundaries of the specific property, then you need to start looking at Planning Act tools as well, that the municipality can play a role through its official plan, through its development approval process, in ensuring that the values and attributes of those heritage cemeteries are protected. So designation protects things inside the boundaries of the property, and that can include natural elements such as trees, plantings. Many cemetery bylaws passed in the last 10 years explicitly include natural elements as part of the overall list of heritage attributes, including mature trees, which, as Rob says, are often some of the most magnificent trees in Ontario are found in cemeteries. People sometimes worry that designation will interfere with the routine operation of a cemetery. There are actually quite a few designated cemeteries that remain active cemeteries that have new interments taking place, and a designation bylaw need not interfere either with routine landscaping, such as mowing the grass or gardening, nor should it interfere with new burials. It would primarily give the municipal council approval authority over alterations that would affect heritage attributes, which would be specifically set out in the bylaw, but again, not including those routine day-to-day operations that make an active cemetery function. So what can you protect? Well, there are bylaws out there, and these are all quotes that are drawn from one, little excerpts from one designation bylaw or another. So the obvious things, the markers and the monuments, including the specific location of those monuments and their orientation relative to each other, and then the broader landscape orientation, the specifics of the layout of the grounds can be protected as a heritage attribute. And monuments and sculptures that are not specifically memorials, but you often find other kinds of decorative elements within a cemetery that can also be protected. The park-like setting, here we're getting into the cultural heritage landscape values, mature trees, other kinds of landscaping can absolutely be identified and protected through a designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. And views and vistas, Wendy mentioned this, that views are often something that are quite important. That cemeteries were sited so that they had specific views of elements that were outside the boundaries of the cemetery. Now, a designation bylaw can only protect things that fall within the boundaries of the property. So if the view or the vista is of something that is beyond the boundaries of the property, that's when you start to get into the Planning Act tools. So the Planning Act gives you a number of different useful protective mechanisms that you can apply. You can establish as part of your approval process, the municipal approval process for certain kinds of planning applications, requirements that heritage impacts will be assessed. And that not only for changes within the boundaries of the cemetery property itself, but also on adjacent lands to the cemetery. So if there's a development application for a property that is next to a cemetery, that may have an effect on the cultural heritage value of the cemetery, and that impact can be assessed and mitigation strategies can be adopted. And as I mentioned before, significant views, usually in the form of view corridors, to or from a property can be mapped out in municipal planning instruments to protect those views beyond the boundaries of the cemetery property itself. And this is a case of the City of Ottawa's official plan having a very specific set of provisions for protecting views from the Beechwood Cemetery, which is a National Historic Site of Canada. And if you stand in front of the Tommy Douglas Monument in Beechwood Cemetery and turn to face roughly towards the west, you have a view across the City of Ottawa to the Parliament buildings and to Parliament Hill. And the area within that yellow triangle has been mapped out as a protected view corridor so that minor variance, zoning bylaw amendments, other kinds of Planning Act applications will not allow structures to be built that would interfere with that specific view. And as you can see, it's quite a large area cutting across a swath of the City of Ottawa that has in fact been affected by this specific Planning Act protection. Our ministry does have other functions besides administering the Ontario Heritage Act, of course, but within the world of heritage conservation, we also provide a lot of information, share knowledge, and help people with technical advisory services. So this is something I wanted to call your attention to. If you're not already aware, it's a book we publish. It's available through Publications Ontario on the Service Ontario website. It can be ordered in hard copy, and it's called Landscapes of Memory. It doesn't deal with working with the Ontario Heritage Act tools. It deals with technical advice around monument conservation, so dealing with stone monuments, and also how to start on a project, how to work with some of the more hands-on technical aspects of cemetery conservation. It's a very useful resource. If you haven't got a copy, I encourage you to seek it out on the Service Ontario Publications website. But if you're interested in working with the Ontario Heritage Act tools, we have a number of guidebooks and other resources available. Again, they can be ordered through the Service Ontario Publications website. They're also available as free downloads from our website. And I'm happy to talk about those or anything else in the Q&A period or afterwards. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and the other panelists. I'm going to actually ask everyone to go back up to the dais, and we've got about 12 minutes left to get you done by 5 and get you some time that you can prepare for the gala, hopefully, which most of you will be attending. I'm going to take questions from the floor. We have Councillor Pat Pyle here from the town of Midland, who will be passing the microphone around. When you ask your question, maybe you could identify whether you want a specific panelist to answer it or whether comments from the entire panel.
Whatever, I think a number of panelists sort of alluded to this question without actually addressing it directly. It's the question of the information on old tombstones, which is when it's barely legible. Are there methods, are there people who are endeavouring to record this information before it's completely illegible, before the history of the tombstone is lost? the techniques which you recommend to do it.
I think the document that was just referenced, the Landscapes of Memory booklet, has technical advice on the actual conservation of the stone material and ensuring that if there is any remnants there, that it's properly cleaned and stabilized. But I think that's a technical question, and I think that a conservator is necessary to assist in that. As was mentioned through the Ministry of Culture. So.
But if the information, you don't want to, you may not want to recut tombstone.
Oh, no.
But other just the techniques of reading information, illumination or whatever, so that it can then be recorded electronically.
Rob, I'm just wondering.
I don't have any good technical advice on this. There is some information on that in the Landscapes Memories booklet. There are also a number of specialist technical groups. ICOMOS Canada has a group that specializes in stone conservation, and they have done a lot of work on monument stones, including how to recover lettering that has been substantially deteriorated. So there is information out there. I would advise you to go through either if you have access to an expert conservator, or even start by looking at the local historical society and getting in touch with some of those groups that have the technical expertise. The Canadian Conservation Institute is another good place to go looking for information about recovering information from monuments or things like that, where it's been partially lost. Just a quick point, you want to check with your local OGS. They may have recorded it,
Right.
or a lot of the local groups have photographed cemeteries, and it'll be in their archival documents.
There must be ways of photographing deteriorating stones. So
Yeah, and many of them done it. Even in the 40s and 50s that was done. So,
I'm dealing with a cemetery right now in my community that's about 200 years old, and they don't have a fund. Their fund is basically run out. The congregation is still operating, but they come now to the municipality asking for assistance. It's a designated cemetery. It's containing lots and lots of important people, but they are just saying, we can't. Like, we're dealing with a voluntary group cutting the grass. Can't even get people to cut the grass. How are we going to deal with this in the long run? And so I was just wondering if you guys have any ideas in terms of working with the public, engaging, and what needs to click. Because if we say, well, sure, the municipality can look after this cemetery, but then do we look after the next cemetery? Do we look after the next cemetery? Where does that line? Where do you draw the line in that way? And if you guys could help with that, that'd be great.
Who wants to tackle that one?
well, we certainly is a huge issue. One of the ways is a lot of groups, citizens are coming together to incorporate, and that's when people are more likely to give money, if you're a legal entity. Secondly, I'd contact your local genealogical society and get a list of the descendants. There's been a lot of success stories where you bring descendants together, people who have a connection, and get them to start raising money. And they may well donate money. Having picnics, special events. Also, write a little article for our Cemetery News. I never cease to be amazed that the big switchboard out there, people will say, God, I know somebody who might have lived there and want to give money. A designation doesn't protect a cemetery. But just like our house, designation has helped us to raise money. And finally, if you apply to a Trillium grant or any other grants, one of the most useful things I do is I act as a reference for groups, because this is a really important work that citizens are taking on.
We're going to go to the back first, and then the other corner, and then we'll come back.
Actually, this is a response to the question about how people can document. There's a recent article that came out of a gentleman working with OGS, as well as California Cemetery and St. Paul Cemetery in Kingston, Alexander Gaboff, who's using digital imaging for recovering lost inscriptions, and it's actually proven to be very effective. So his last name is Gabov, and he actually has an article published on that, so that might be further information.
Thank you. That corner.
In response to the trying to get information off the stone, just contact the monument company, see if they take a rubbing. Sometimes you can read it off a rubbing, but more easily than you can just looking at it.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to go here, and then we'll come here.
Hi there. I like how someone said that all cemeteries are important. And the reason why I'm saying that is because in our community we come across a cemetery, and this might challenge that, it's actually a pet cemetery. And we've been talking a lot about, and what I think everyone's been keeping in their minds is cemeteries of humans, but this was actually identified in a heritage impact assessment as being worthy of designation and repair for. So, in my quest for information, I'm wondering if you know of any examples, maybe this is a good question for Wendy, of pet cemeteries. And just to wrap your minds around this is very interesting. I'm sure everyone's wondering what this cemetery is like. And a lot of the gravestones are quite substantial, actually. Some of them are almost as tall as I am, very elaborate. And I'm wondering if you have any information on that.
Well, I haven't encountered a pet cemetery in North America, but I know in the UK on the large estates there's always an area designated for 200 years of family pets with grave markers and everything. But I don't believe it's been a tradition here, so you may qualify as a rare cemetery.
And it sounds like it might be a good session for next year's conference.
I do have a pet cemetery on my farm. But you know what? I think Mike will think I was pretty crazy. But no,
I just want to clarify. We do not regulate pet cemeteries. Because we get the question all the time. What are we supposed to do? We do not regulate pet cemeteries, and we do not allow burials of pets in cemeteries. You want to have a pet cemetery, you can have a pet cemetery across the road, adjacent to the cemetery, but not in the cemetery.
You have your pet buried with you.
Not legally. I do hear the stories about some funeral directors that slipped the cremated remains of Snuffy into the casket. Whatever. But no. Cemeteries are for human remains.
That's really interesting you brought that up because in Oshawa we're dealing with the cemetery and remains of 11 horses, including Northern Dancer, and also there's a Trillium cemetery as well, which is not necessarily part of the core cemetery core area in Winfield, but it's still there's substantial horses. Anyway, my question was, and we want to designate that, by the way. Regarding, you mentioned designation doesn't protect the cemeteries, doesn't protect the buildings either, for that matter. But my question was for my planner to ask, what are the benefits of designation as opposed to just listing the cemetery? Would anybody be able to answer that question?
I'm happy to start taking that on, but you can add to it. So, designation does protect in the sense that it gives the council of the municipality some decision-making authority over changes. That doesn't protect the cemetery against deterioration over time. It doesn't ensure the ongoing maintenance and upkeep of the cemetery. That is a separate issue. But it certainly does provide a measure of protection from direct alterations, re-landscaping, or building right on the cemetery, or indeed, if the planning tools are in place, it also protects the cemetery from an unsympathetic development nearby or adjacent to. The key thing is that when you're talking about cemeteries, you're not really talking about protection from demolition. So listing something on the municipal register is really simply a minimal expression of the municipality's recognition that 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 property has some cultural heritage value, and that can be used as a trigger for requiring some impact assessment when there's a planning act matter that's coming forward. So if somebody wants to do a rezoning of the property next door, if the appropriate policies are in place at the municipality, and that means that they have to be in the planning documents, in the municipal official plan, etc., then there are means of applying that protection. The thing with designation is that it identifies heritage attributes. Listing does not. So if you want to identify and protect specific heritage attributes, physical attributes of the property, that's when you really need to look at an individual designation of the property or an easement as opposed to a listing. The other tool that is interesting, although not widely used, some cemeteries, not very many, fall inside the boundaries of heritage conservation districts. And then again, you're getting into a bit more of like a planning framework where you can apply design guidelines that would protect certain elements of the surroundings of the cemetery. The design guidelines can apply specific, you can have specific guidelines that would apply to the cemetery, but also to the surrounding area of the cemetery. But for the most part, when you're talking about protecting the cemeteries, it's individual designations, and there it's really about the attributes.
Can I talk to this designation? How?
Sure.
As a result,
We're going to, Michael, we'll let you answer, and then we'll go one last question, and we'll wrap up.
Rob talked about the closure process and the court cases and the license fee tribunal hearings and stuff. As a result of that, we have implemented a policy that when somebody applies to us to close a cemetery, the first thing we would ask them is it a designated cemetery under the Heritage Act? And if it is, we tell them, you need to go back and apply to have that designation lifted before we will even consider your application. And so we won't deal, so that sort of puts another little layer between, in the process, so it's not that easy to close the cemetery. You'd need, if it has a designation on it, they'd have to go back and apply. Now, they can go back and apply to have it taken off, and then whether or not it's taken off, we consider that in the decision making. So obviously, if the community decides they're not going to take it off, it would be a big element to consider in the decision making process. Okay, so it's one way of protecting cemetery.
We're just going to do the one last question. But certainly, I think panelists may be more than willing to answer your questions after the session wraps up.
I know we're all really aware that there's a huge problem out there with small cemeteries, maybe church-run cemeteries, like we saw yesterday, wonderful historic stones laying in the ground. And these people really don't know what direction to take. They don't have the funding. They're doing everything they can just to keep the heat on in the building. Our congregations are declining, so there's no money to keep this up. A lot of rural cemeteries basically are turning over to the municipality. So what I was looking for is maybe if we could get some help through the ministry to set up maybe guidelines, how to get funding, where to start, even if it's just a blurb on a website or a brochure that goes out to cemetery owners that gives them some help, because some of them aren't really aware of what they have and how it's deteriorating. And another thing that we need to add to that is the resources that they can get, best practices of restoring stones and caring for them.
So
One good model, I think, was in King Township, where the Municipal Heritage Committee decided, okay, we're not going to do buildings anymore. When they talked to me, they said, we're not going to do buildings anymore, but we're not going to give the money back, because they got some money from the township. So they decided to take on a cemetery every year. and slowly start restoring them. And they learned along. And that's a great model, and there are some other models out there. So, again, I think to talk about it openly, your problems, write us a letter, and I would encourage the province, though, to have some grants for this. We think that it's important. It's one of the key issues in the history of Ontario, and there should be some funding. Trillium has, though, done some funding, but it does require political leadership. Isabel Bassett, when she was the Minister of Culture, gave funding out to restore cemeteries. And the one, the one at between at 401 and 427, money was given there to the Etobicoke Historical Society by the province to restore. So it can be done if there is political will and political leadership.
Great. I think that's actually a perfect place to wrap up. I'd like to thank Wendy, Steve, Michael, Rob, and Andrew for giving their time and their wisdom here today. Hopefully you all learned something. I know I did, particularly as we continue to tackle the challenges of the William Wilson Cemetery. Thanks, everybody, and join me in congratulating all our panelists here today.